Though I've never admitted it, I've always been a little bit afraid of the moon. The ghostly shadow of the sun, always lingering with no warmth and little light. So, what motive does it have? I could never predict the moon. Its size, position, shape, and color could change at whim like a sinister skinwalker, serving only vampire bats and, just by stretching high, endangering man. The only constant, reliable fact I knew was that the moon appeared at night. And yet, at day it sometimes lingered like a grossly misshapen cloud, a too perfect circle for nature alone to carve. I always felt threatened by its looming presence. Once on a winter's night, I was driving home along the M4 motorway, and the moon had consumed the entire horizon. It was larger than I had ever seen. A yellow wall of unpunctured brick stood seemingly on the hills to my left. Despite the road ahead, I couldn't look away. My speed of 90 kilometers remained unreined and while gazing out the passenger window. The moon's presence was so powerful, like the white of a wolf's eye. I felt a tense wind rip through my skin, as if I was covered in cold fur. I stared, neglecting my growing speed. I plunged into the back of the station wagon ahead. I was fine and so was he. The only pain was a shortly missed breath and a dent in our vehicles, one each. Nothing that my insurance wouldn't cover. It seems funny now, looking back to that night, that the end of the world would come from an inconsequential speck which lay idly aside the moon's awesome presence. And there was no insurance for the damage that it would cause. It appeared in April. One night we went to bed and one morning we rose to see the stain of the sky. It had no formal name despite its relevance. No wonder. There wasn't anything characteristic about it. It was a dot, no more no less, smaller than the moon and sun respectively. Black. It was just a dot. They delivered the news with stoicism. Domesticated tongues contradicted with their eyes. Their eyes where the truth could always be seen. Ripped red and darting, their eyes screamed their mind's truths while the tame tongue spat word after scripted word. So too, you could see these stains on their shirts begin to seep through. Coffee in cups jittering seconds before the cameras went live began to taint the purity of the cotton. The politicians, of course, had a plan. An elaborate speech where nothing was said, followed by an action. They said that we had 3 years. A lot can change in 3 years. 3 years ago, a different man stood in place, but I am here now for my country. Of course, they turned this into a game of bows. None of us knew how or why, but the black dot hailed the world's end. It was a hostile spaceship, filled with alien armies. It was God's wrathful finger aimed with like arrow, a rogue asteroid, a Russian laser satellite, a black of hole for you to fill in. What it was we may not have known, but it was cancerous nonetheless. Though the world could see it, the first to mark it was a man named Isaac Odea, a NASA-involved astronomer who briefly after his discovery drew a black dot of his own, right between his eyes. In the first year of the 3 that remained, the world was relatively quiet. At first, I admired our race for keeping our heads unified in such a crisis, though in hindsight, I now see it was just clear denial. Surprisingly, from a straying Christian-based society whose need for God has been long outgrown, many scurried to Mass, a lot of whom had never been. The churches became more and more packed with each Sunday that passed. When the doors were forced shut, some folk took matters to their own hands. Cults sprouted like weeds, charming and ambitious men who would never live to their destined potential, built ranches, land, churches, and safe haven communities for those desperate enough to outlive the apocalypse. "Are you willing to work in the new world?" Posters would read that littered the streets. "Are you worthy to outlive the rapture?" wrote some scoutmaster types. Though these were mostly extreme cases and had a little effect on the real world. For the tamer, grounded population, their lives focused shifted to life's pleasures. Parties were rampant, personal disputes were disbanded. Everyone became a thrill seeker, doing the things they had spoken of doing for decades now. With no time to waste and consequences becoming futile fears. Why not go hang gliding in Brazil? Screw it, we'll go next weekend. And so my parents took one last holiday. My friends choked on copious amounts of coke at clubs. My boss abandoned his multi-millionaire company after no buyer saw value. And I just kind of waited. I carried on as normal, though I suppose my normal life was already one of hopelessness. In truth, I had given up long before the world began to end. Its rotten decay meant nothing to a heart beating faintly as mine. I had no aspirations, never dreamt a lot or desired much. In truth, another first admission, my only true goal was to father children, and maybe, I suppose, get a published piece of writing. But when Olivia left a year before that dream, and further aspiration had gone with her. After she blocked my number, I had written her letters, seal, address, and I would date them. But not one was ever sent. I don't know why I did it. It started as my take on an exercise my therapist had given me, but grew into a shameful obsession. I think it was just the closest I could get to closure, or contact, but it was never enough to settle my seeking mind. And on the topic of fleeing, my therapist left late during the year. Though he was a good man and doing his best to allocate his time to helping the dying, depressed, and damned, he was but a man. In these times, the world was focused on whatever foolish endeavors they thought would save them. Preachers screamed louder and on higher soapboxes. Protesters marched tighter and implored political action. One man I passed in the street waved a sign with a vigor akin to a patriot with his flag. "The solution is simple," he told me as if I had asked. "We empty a town, any will do. Fill it to the brim with military, and nuke the crap out of it." On another rare venture past my mailbox, I saw a young woman urinating out the front of a police station, clearly intoxicated at 11 in the morning nonetheless. The officer, a clean-shaven bloke with a pressed shirt who, if not driven by professional matters, must have been the less bit personally disturbed by this unhygienic act. He didn't move. "It doesn't matter. We're all screwed anyway. We're all done," she slurred and screamed at passers-by. And the officer must have agreed, for he looked, laughed, and carried on. In the second year, the smiling stoicism and screw-it attitude of the prior had dulled. In place of laughter came a silence. For months, depression, both economic and behavioral, consumed the world. Most small family businesses had shut, focusing their limited income on the remaining 20-odd months to come. The big dogs, the billionaire babies, the brands and businesses stayed open, though you'd often see a lack of casual staff running registers. The supermarkets turned to an honesty system of self-checkouts. I had started to keep a diary, another one of the shrink's ideas. If the world isn't evaporated instantly, someone may very well find it and read the account of the most pathetic protagonist imaginable. I'm sure it'll confirm the aliens' narrative of our incompetence. It seemed that the world had stopped, laid down and prepared to die. The politicians had vanished and the streets became unkempt. As the buildings and roads deteriorated, so too did the social structures of man. And death rates jumped. In my quiet isolation, which was really no different than the majority of my life, I thought more and more of her. God, what I would give to spend the last year and a half with her. Sure, I had nothing to lose, but that also meant that I had nothing to sacrifice. I found myself on a walk once. I had to see what, if any, life remained in the desolation. Subconsciously, I must have taken myself to her place. I swear that I didn't mean to show at the time, but there I had walked, standing outside her door. This was probably the first time I had cried since the announcement in the April prior, and I mean, I really cried. I considered myself unfeeling, unnerving, and cold as a common and pathetic defense. But lies are fragile things, and lies to yourself are the weakest type, because you already know the truth. My wailing had drawn attention by some others out for a walk. 3 boys approached me and mocked me for my display. At least it wasn't her. The strangers shoved me into the semi-secluded path weaving behind the complex of townhouses in which I stood. This spot would normally be tucked in a nightly shadow, if not for the bleeding sun, and its small black, nameless friend above. I was further mocked, before being kicked, beaten, and robbed. Looking back, it's so funny. Why, I had asked them, why do you even need my money now? Well, there's not much else we can do, they had laughed. I can see your face, I commented blankly. It wasn't meant to be a challenge, it was just curious to me how little it mattered to them. The boy from the back stood forward and flashed a knife. God, he flung it fast. Narrowly timed, I managed my hands to face and the blade tore through my pale flesh. Blood seeped and squirted like a crimson cascade onto the pavement. I didn't yell, just turned heel and ran. Olivia's house was nowhere near my home. It was stupid to take such a long walk. Thankfully, I knew of a local health clinic a few blocks over. Well, in all honesty, it was a vet, but it mattered little because upon entry, I was greeted by vacant silence, with only the resonating sound of my blood dripping to keep me company. It was midday, midweek, and I was robbed and alone in a vet. It was just so funny. By November, the streets spoke again. One of the major cults, the Repented, marched down a city long since abandoned. They had weapons, but no one cared less. The Repented theorized the Tao was a doorway for the raptured, the holy souls who would be taken to heaven on the day of the world's end. The Repented believed they were the new disciples of Jesus Christ, and when the rapture came, they would be excluded for past sins and instead, they would be chosen to stay and spread the new gospel. I think their vision of Jesus is a high school jock or something, because these guys didn't come across as the helpful happy folk who had locked the church doors a year before. An opposing cult, the Welcome Party, believed in fact the dot above was a mothership containing an entire population of higher beings who would take Earth, and in accordance to plan, used the members of the Welcome Party as slaves and servants to rid the world of infidels. It didn't take long before the cults began to clash, driven by the powerful motivation of fear and inadequacy. If only Isaac Odea had told us what he saw. In the chaos of the crazies, the more grounded population was taken up by gangs. They would rob, wreck, and riot because the hang gliders were closed, and the who care attitude demanded stimulation. I was torn. I spent my time in a house with faltering power and resources. My isolation drew on my mind. Before I found comfort in the thought of being alone, I was defiant to a world which wanted to help me, which wanted me to live. Now what was I? I couldn't rebel where there was no system. Outside the world was red and rampaged in the setting sun of civilization. Inside, the darkness drew closer, and my sanity slipped with each bottle I drained. The 3rd year began somewhere along the way. I don't know who was counting the days. Maybe she was, I thought, maybe. Maybe I should ask her what the time was, or the day. That was a good enough excuse, no? I just had to see her before the end. This time, I drove to her house, not wishing to go scurrying for bandages again. I drove about 90 kilometers consistently, not caring about the road rules but lacking the confidence to drive faster. I just had to see her once more. The moon that night was high. It looked far, far away, yet it was looking straight down at me, bathing me solely in its meaningless light. I didn't need it. I just had to see her. Rain fell lightly yet failed to dull the fire that pranced. I stood in her driveway, bathed in a nightly shadow. I just had to have her one more time. I drove home in the oncoming lane. Only one car passed me. He was going 160 at least. My internals had taken a vile plummet and bile leaked through my tears. When I got home, I ripped open the door and left it ajar, leaving just as much a path of reckoning as I had done at hers. I pointed a gun into my mouth. This was the only other time that I cried. My finger never twitched as it closed in on the trigger, but I still chose not to pull it. Not because I feared death. Not because I made peace, but because I didn't deserve the quick way out. I wouldn't allow myself a death so seductive. The wolves, the ones that howled at the inverted moon, I would let them pick me apart. Either that or when the end came, I would embrace whatever horrible hell it meant for us. After all, there wasn't much time left. I took a walk. To the center of town, I trotted slowly, wanting for the wolves to pick at my poisoned flesh. In typical fashion, none paid mind. Some things never change, I guess. My skin was shameful. It was evil. It was animal. It was the new normal. The wolves and vampires I walked past were too occupied with pointless violence. Bodies lay, coughing and choking on their own swallowed teeth. And mere meters away, groups of naked figures joined together in piles. I didn't know what started it. I had been inside for too long, but I know it was in them, us along. The moon. God, how I wish it was blood red. I just wanted some confirmation that it all meant something, but it didn't. No one was driving our hand. As the hands closed on the doomsday clock, nothing changed. We stood there and howled at the moon and its lesser, darker twin, which hid from us behind the stars. When the sun rose and the fires dimmed, we looked up to see the black dot was gone. With it, every act of sincerity and sin cleansed with the sunrise of April 1st. Later, they would come from below. The devil somehow wore the cleanest suit. As it turns out, the stain on the sky was nothing but a projection that NASA had imposed. The apocalypse had happened. These 3 years lasted a detox for the elite. While we ate the flesh of our sons, they chowed on caviar crackers and vintage vino. While we'd been out here suffering, dying, and mentally decaying, they'd been biding their time in brumation like snakes awaiting a winter's pass. The population has been significantly lowered with poor killing poor, and those who remain, so drenched in heavy blood that they'll either sink or be subjected to unarguable capital punishment. We've bought solely from those rich enough to keep the lights on, but in all fairness, they did nothing to force our hand. In a way, it was a rapture, a waterhole poisoning that killed whatever lies we, as a society, had told ourselves. God did not make us, and if he did, he made us no different than the lions, wolves, and apes. We were only chosen by our fathers, and like them, our legacy is nothing but a continuing path of biology. Tomorrow, the world resumes. I think I may go see my therapist.